hands over to have minimum wage workers, even those without children, to be living in poverty. Does the government really think that it is acceptable in 21st century Ireland, a country with immense wealth, some of the most productive workers in the world, that a full-time job is not enough to lift someone out of poverty? Yesterday, the Taoiseach, actually, in response to this, he said, well, the answer to poverty and deprivation is work. But these people are working. They're not unemployed. They're working hard, they're working full-time, and they're in poverty. A worker works a full week and is not able to pay the bills. And that's why the essence of this point is that it is time to lift the minimum wage to a real living wage for all. No worker should be left in poverty, and that means fighting for a €15 an hour minimum wage. In this debate, there will be, and there are in public, lots of myths and half kind of ideas spun out there about minimum wage workers. Stories that are told to try to justify the payment of poverty wages. To listen to those who oppose increases in minimum wage, the increases in the minimum wage, you would have the impression that minimum wage workers are all young, part-time workers, earning a bit of pocket money for the weekend. That obviously wouldn't justify paying poverty wages, but it's not even true. 2/3 of those on the minimum wage are full-time workers. 90% are in permanent positions. We have the most educated minimum wage workers in Europe. These are hard-working people doing essential work and trying to make a living, and they deserve a decent raise. The German government, under pressure, just announced that they will increase their minimum wage to €12 this year. If the government won't agree with our demand for 15, well, will the Irish government at least do 12, which would be about at the real increase of inflation for those who are on low income. 1 in 4 workers in Ireland earn less than €12 an hour. That includes huge numbers of workers in childcare, in retail and hospitality. Those precisely who were clapped by the government over the course of the last 2 years. They don't want applause, they want respect, and they want a decent wage. In the US, the Fight for 15 campaign won a $15 minimum wage being phased in a number of different states. We need a similar movement here to fight for a €15 an hour minimum wage. Many TDs, when this is discussed, they balk at the idea of €15 an hour. They suggest it's a unreasonably high figure. But the reality is €15 an hour amounts to €2,500 a month or €30,000 a year for a full-time worker. Ireland is a wealthy country. There is no reason why a full-time worker should be earning less than €30,000. Look at rent. I mean, for a one-bedroom apartment in Dublin, it's €1,500 a month. How could anyone be expected to actually live a decent life, to raise a family, on less than €2,500 a month? The Taoiseach, who presumably opposes a €15 an hour minimum wage, earns €215,000 a year, while a minimum wage worker earns 10% of that, €21,000. That is simply not right. How can it be justified to earn 10 times that of an ordinary worker? Does the Taoiseach think that that's fair? Does the government think that that's fair? Or take someone like Paul Reid, head of the HSE, earning 20 times the wage of a minimum wage cleaner, for example. We need to raise the wages for the low paid and cut them for the tiny few at the very top. Look at rents continuing to go through the roof. The latest staff.ie rental price report. In South County Dublin, for example, the average price of a one-bed apartment rent is now €1,549. A 3-bed house is €2,290. Rents are going up 5 or 10% across the country. Energy bills went up 40% or more, and yet the minimum wage went up less than 3%. That is a cut in real income for the low paid in this country. While TDs have gotten pay rise after pay rise, and one senior official recently got an €81,000 raise, low-paid workers are expected to make do with less. If TDs' wages were linked to the minimum wage, we would have seen a proper increase a long time ago. This also takes place in the context of the cost of living crisis and the debate about that. We should remember that when we raised this last year, the government told us that the price hikes are transitory. We warned in October with the first Dail motion about this crisis, and again in December, that anything less than direct state intervention using powers already available to them would not address the crippling rise in energy and heating costs. Then they announced a tiny subsidy of €100 for electricity consumers. The government is obviously trying desperately to distance itself from Minister Sean Fleming's comments about shopping around, but the truth is that's the government programme. Go and read the amendment that was put forward to gut our motion on the energy prices crisis. And the bottom line point is the market will provide. Again and again, in answers to PQs and in answers in the Dáil here, the government has put forward the idea that, well, you need to go and shop around. Because the reality is the government is ideologically opposed to imposing regulation on market forces or taking things out of the control of the market and into public ownership. It pretends that nothing can be done. This is a global rise in inflation. And what is hidden under that is the fact of profits. This is, to a substantial degree, a profit-driven inflation in this country. It is not a kind of automatic fact of life that big business just keeps the big profits that they're making. Year in, year out, the costs go up for them and they just pass those costs on and ordinary people's lives get harder. The question of who pays the price for inflation, that's an active political and class struggle question. And the determination of big business and of the government is that workers pay the price for inflation, both by seeing declining wages in real terms and seeing increased prices. But all the indications so far from the balance sheets coming out of big business is that they're not hurting at all. Shell and BP announced last week that they're on track to make £40 billion sterling worth of profits this year. ESB announced significant profits, an increase in profits last year. Energia, significant increase in profits. And we don't accept that. And we say that that can be cut into by, on the one hand, price controls, which the government has the power to do and refuses to do it, but secondly, by workers fighting for a pay increase. Across the country, workers are demanding pay rises, and they're right. If workers don't organise and speak up, they will lose out. But when they do fight back, they have power, they have extra power in the current situation of the economy, and they can win real improvements. Before Christmas, for example, Dunstores workers campaigned for and won a 10% increase. That should be an inspiration to other workers to do the same, to talk to their fellow workers, to link in with their union, to push for a meeting of all staff to discuss a pay claim and to lodge a pay claim. The same goes for public sector workers. They should be organising now to demand an emergency pay increase to go beyond the rate of inflation. And for us, raising the minimum wage is a part of this. It not only helps the very low paid out of poverty, but by raising the wage floor, it helps to raise the wages of all workers. It also helps to strengthen the negotiating power of other workers who are already above the rate of the minimum wage. The final point I'll make is that we also need to end age discrimination when it comes to the minimum wage in this country. It is blatant discrimination that people under the age of 20 will be entitled to earn less than the minimum wage. They're doing the same work and they should be paid the same for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hirlock, and I thank People Before Profit Solidarity for raising this motion. The government notes this motion from People Before Profit Solidarity on the minimum wage. It expresses a concern regarding rising inflation and with the welfare of the low paid. These are two concerns that this government shares. However, this motion ignores what this government has done and is doing to address issues around cost of living and to ensure rising incomes and rising living standards for the low paid. Firstly, with regard to the problems of inflation and the cost of living increases, I know the pressures that people are feeling. The annual rate of consumer price inflation, as measured by the European Union's harmonised index of consumer prices, has picked up sharply in recent months, reaching a multi-decade high of 5.7% in the month of December. The government recognises that those on lower incomes are being disproportionately affected. But it should be noted that the recent rise in inflation is primarily the result of global factors and consequently largely beyond the reach of government policy. These inflationary pressures are partly the result of temporary factors related to the pandemic, which are expected to fade over time. We need to be aware of the risk of higher inflation expectations feeding through to wage price spiral. This risk to the inflation outlook increases the longer this temporary period of high inflation lasts. The government has already pursued a large range of measures to protect households from the rising cost of living. Budget 2022 contained a personal income tax package worth €520 million and a social welfare package of over €550 million. The fuel allowance was increased by €5 per week to compensate lower income households for the additional energy costs they are likely to incur. There were also increases in the allocation of early learning and care and school-aged childcare to ensure childcare prices do not rise. The government has also approved an electricity costs emergency benefit scheme, payment of up to €100 to be made this year to an estimated of 2.1 million electricity account holders. In addition to these actions already taken, colleagues across government, along with their officials, have been tasked with developing proposals for a package to help families with the cost of living, and my government will finalise this package very shortly. Secondly, with regards to the incomes and living standards for the low paid, again what this government has done and is doing to address the issues should be acknowledged. Central to this have been the increases to the minimum wage. Since its establishment in 2015, the Low Pay Commission has been responsible for making annual recommendations to government on the appropriate rate of the national minimum wage. The national minimum wage seeks to find a balance between a fair and sustainable rate for low-paid workers and one that will not have significant negative consequences for employers and competitiveness. As it is legally enforceable, it provides protection for workers. The Low Pay Commission is made up of an equal number of employer representatives, employee representatives and independent members, which helps to provide a balanced view when determining an appropriate rate for national minimum wage. In addition, the establishing legislation requires that the Low Pay Commission to give consideration to a range of issues when arriving at a recommendation for the appropriate national minimum wage. These issues include the cost of living, competitiveness and the likely effect that any proposed recommendation will have on future levels of employment. When considering increases in the national minimum wage during a period of inflation, government must be conscious of the need to avoid second-round effects or a wage price spiral. The Low Pay Commission is legislatively required to provide a recommendation to the Minister by the third week in July. Any recommended change in the minimum wage is then normally announced as part of the budget in October, coming into force the following January. The Low Pay Commission has made 6 recommendations on the national minimum wage since it was established, and the government has accepted each of these recommendations. The national minimum wage has increased from €8.65 per hour to €10.50 per hour between 2016 and 2022, in line with the recommendations from the Low Pay Commission. The government is supportive of the Low Pay Commission and the work it has carried out since its foundation and respects the independence of the Low Pay Commission. The government is committed to protecting low-paid workers, many of whom have continued to work in sectors providing important services throughout the pandemic. It is estimated that at least 135,000 people saw an increase in their wages due to the last increase in the minimum wage in January, with many others on slightly higher pay levels also getting a knock-on increase. Today, Ireland has one of the highest minimum wages in the European Union. Recently released data from the Eurostat shows that as of the 1st of January 2022, 21 of the 27 EU member states have national minimum wages. In terms of gross monthly rates, Ireland has the second highest national minimum wage of these 21 member states. When adjusted for purchasing power standards, PBP-S, Ireland ranks as 6th. The share of workers on the minimum wage in Ireland has fallen consistently since the establishment of the Low Pay Commission. The share of workers on a minimum wage or less as a percentage of the total labour force has reduced from 9.3% in Q4 2016 to 6.8% in the fourth quarter of 2020. It should also be noted that Ireland has amongst the highest wages in the European Union. Median gross hourly earnings in Ireland were €17.97 in 2018, 36% above the EU 27 average of €13.18. And Ireland's personal taxation regime is viewed as being one of the most progressive in terms of income redistribution in both the European Union and the OECD. It is characterised by a large number of earners who are exempt from income tax, followed by a relatively steep climb from entry to the taxation net at an annual wage of circa €17,000 to entry to the top rate of taxation at earnings of €36,800, which is below the national average wage of €38,846. The Tax Strategy Group Papers 2021 showed that 989,000 earners, 36% of total, are exempt from income tax. This includes people on the national minimum wage and low pay. Ireland has a well-established system to set the minimum wage based around the Low Pay Commission. This system works well. Since its establishment, Low Pay Commission has delivered 6 consecutive annual increases in minimum wage, and the next recommendation on the national minimum wage is due to be received in July of this year. As well as considering the national minimum wage, the Low Pay Commission is also currently tasked with examining the issues of a living wage and a universal basic income pilot. Reports from the Low Pay Commission on both of these matters are due to be received within the first half of this year. The Government respects the Low Pay Commission and its independence. It supports the work it is currently doing on the living wage, UBI, and preparing for its July recommendations. I expect, as with all Low Pay Commission recommendations, their Government will indicate its planned approach following receipt of those recommendations. Thank you, Cearla.
Richard Boyd Barrett.
Yeah. So the government haven't got the guts to stand up publicly and argue with us in reality or oppose what we're asking for here, which is an emergency review of the minimum wage and, in our view, the need to increase it to as an absolute minimum €15. So they're going to accept our motion, but with absolutely no intention of actually acting on it. And the public out there should know that. That is the cynical way in which politics operates in here and the way this government behaves. They're spineless, but then behind the scenes, they operate to maintain the status quo and effectively ignore the really desperate situation that working people are facing at the moment as a result of the government's own failures. Now, the only defence really the government's put up is to say, well, inflation is not our fault; it's a global phenomenon, and there's not a lot we can do. We can take some measures, but it's not really our fault. And I think again we need to seriously challenge that narrative. This government, along with European governments and other governments, have championed the privatisation and deregulation of energy markets over the last 20 years and are showing no intention of rolling back on that. In fact, quite the opposite. When People Before Profit brought a motion in October warning about the escalating energy crisis and asking at that time for price controls on energy, the government reiterated its commitment to so-called competitive markets in energy. Right? So when Sean Fleming says what he said the other day, this is not some maverick comment about shopping around. It is the government's policy. And it has been the government's policy, and Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, for 20 years. Since you removed the not-for-profit mandate of the ESB, since you privatised Bord Gáis, energy prices have gone through the roof, and now we are really paying the bitter price for that. That's the truth. And of course that's part of an international phenomena, but you lot championed it and you still are committed to it. And it is in black and white in the speeches of ministers, even as recently as Ossian Smith's speech this week, where he again referred to the competitive market. And I'm just amazed that nobody is questioning this in the media. There is no debate about the link between the deregulation and privatisation of energy supply and the ability of energy companies to ratchet up the cost of energy to stratospheric levels that are now literally impoverishing people, that will claim between 15 and 2,000, maybe 2,500 vulnerable people will unnecessarily die this winter because they can't afford to heat their homes. Excess winter mortality, which is worse than this in this country than most other countries in Europe. And again, people need to know this. Prior to the deregulation and privatisation of energy supply in this country, energy costs were lower in Ireland by a significant margin than the rest of Europe. Today, they are higher, between 15 and 20% on average higher than the rest of Europe. That is your fault. So let's be absolutely clear, that is your fault. Why are energy prices higher here? Because you allow the energy companies to profiteer and price gouge. And people, I mean, I'm just going to shout this from the rooftops, and we are going to shout it from the rooftops until it penetrates into the debate. The companies that are impoverishing people with these massive increases in energy prices are making massive profits. On a global scale, it's simply staggering. Shell and BP, between them, 40 billion last year in profits. But wait for this. If you just look at Shell, Shell's share of that last year was 19.3 billion in profits. Do you know what their profits were the year before that? 4.8 billion. Incredible. Their profits have quadrupled in 1 year. In 1 year. And the same is happening here in Ireland. Energy is profits up 46% last year, up 45% the year before. ESB, 616 million profits 2020, set to be over 700 million for 2021. Okay? So what is being taken out of the pockets of working people, of pensioners, and the vulnerable is going into the pockets of other groups of people who get paid dividends. So the rich are making money out of the misery of the poor. And that is going on in the housing sector as well. It's the same thing. Rents up last year, on average 10%, now they're saying it was 7%, the year before 7%. In total, rents up about 68% over the last decade. Similar increases in the rental income of landlords. Rental income of landlords up 16% in the last 2 years. They're creaming it at the expense of working people, and you lot are facilitating it. So against that background, we say it's time for workers to fight back. They can't take this lying down as absolute minimum to have a minimum wage of €15, which still wouldn't allow you to pay the rent in Dublin, by the way. The idea that the existing minimum wage, I mean, it's just shocking. You know, do you guys get it at all? Rents in my area now, on average, €2,200 a month. You need €26,000 after-tax income just to pay the rent, and you'd be paying 100% of it. But somebody on the minimum wage wouldn't have that. They'd be paying about 120% of their income to pay the average rent in our area. Or for one bedroom, $1,500 across Dublin. In my area, it's about $1,900 to get a one-bedroom apartment. It's just beyond shocking. And you just won't do anything about it because they have the right to make profits. But you could do something about it, and it's done in other countries. Rent controls, set the rents. Decide you can only charge this much for these square meters of rental property. That is done in other countries. And it's the only way, by the way, we're going to deal with it. Even a rent freeze at the level rents are at will not do it. We need to set rents. It is done in other countries. There's no reason why it can't be done here. There is simply no justification for anybody, vulture funds, landlords or anybody else, setting rents at the current levels they are. They are guaranteed, and they are, by the way, as we speak, escalating the homeless crisis again. There was a brief respite from homelessness because you had to bring in eviction bans, something you said, by the way, couldn't happen during COVID. Briefly you brought it in, homelessness went down, then you got rid of the eviction ban, homelessness is on the way back up again. And now it has got to the absolutely extraordinary situation. I am dealing with 3 families who are working and are in homeless accommodation, and they are being told by the local authority to get out of the homeless accommodation because their income has gone above the income threshold. That's the reward they get for working. Get out of the homeless accommodation when they haven't got a chance of getting anything in the area. Being evicted from homelessness. It's reaching obscene levels. So we say, we've given up on you lot, to be honest, right? And what we're saying with this motion to workers is get out and fight now. Right? Because the landlords, the big business people are exploiting the misery and suffering of people, and it's time for workers to stand up and put in pay claims. Insist, like the Duns workers, that we get at least a 10% pay increase. And insist that at an absolute minimum, nobody should have to work for less than €15 an hour. But on top of that, we want the price controls on energy. We want the rent controls in order to bring rents to affordable levels. This government has no interest, in truth, in addressing the root causes of this inflationary spiral, because you are in reality collaborating with the corporate interests that are benefiting from the suffering that people are now having inflicted on them. So, I commend our motion to the House.